record, early voting kicks off in Missouri. Secretary of State Jay Ashcroft joins us live in studio. Plus, the race for Congress in the 2nd Congressional District. House Democrat Trish Gunby challenges Congresswoman Ann Wagner for her job, and Trish Gunby joins us on the record. Plus, St. Louis picks who will lead its Board of Aldermen, that highly anticipated race also on the ballot this November 8th. Progressive candidate Megan Green joins us to respond after Jack Coder was here with us last week. All of that coming up on the record. Thank you for joining us. Missouri Secretary of State Jay Ashcroft joins us now live in studio on the record. Good to have you with us, Mr. Ashcroft.
Thanks for having me.
Do you want to be Missouri's next governor?
Right now, I want to make sure that November 8th goes smoothly, and whoever wins, whoever loses, they know that the election was run well and they either won or lost fairly.
So I'm getting ahead of myself, maybe an election down the road. We have this election, your office administers that and gets the word out. That's one of the reasons you're here for this early voting push. On the voter ID, I want to circle back though and press you. Do you want to run for governor?
When you circle back, I'll answer it.
Well, I just did.
Look, I think I was taught that the best politics is good governance. And I think anyone that wants to move up to a higher office needs to prove that they can do the job where they are. And when you start looking at that next job instead of doing your job, you've generally proved you're not worth it.
But you won't deny that you have that ambition.
Right now, I'm focused on doing my job.
Okay, there's an answer.
And I love to serve the people of the state as long as they allow me to.
A bit of a public service announcement just to start off for people that are voting maybe for the first time with their voter ID. What do those folks need to know? Specifically those, maybe like myself, newer transplants, people who've moved to Missouri who might still have that old state ID. Can they still vote?
Of course. Welcome to Missouri. If you are registered to vote, you can vote. Go to your polling place on Election Day. You'll be able to vote. If you have that government-issued photo ID, your Missouri driver license, your Missouri non-driver's license, your federal government, your military ID, your passport, you can use those and vote just the normal ballot. If you don't have one of those, you can vote a provisional ballot. It's a normal ballot. They just require some extra information from you on the envelope you put that ballot into. You sign that, they put that in a secure location, and then they do a little bit extra to verify you are who you said you were after the polls close. Once they verify you, that ballot just goes right through the tabulator just like every other ballot.
On Amendment 3, to legalize recreational marijuana in Missouri, how will you vote?
I will vote no.
You're going to vote against it? Why?
I think we have a problem with the dichotomy between how the state deals with it and the federal government deals with it. And I think states need to continue to put pressure on the federal government. I don't think
in which direction?
I think I think it's ridiculous that it's not at least a Schedule 2, I guess, drug. I think
you
it's
agree with the Biden policy to remove it from Schedule 1?
I don't know where it should be, but the idea that there is absolutely no therapeutic use for it, I think is silly. I think we ought to be able to do research on it. We do research on opium. That has a therapeutic use. I think we need to look at that. I don't think that this amendment is good for the state. It's way too much to put in our Constitution. If you think that marijuana should be decriminalized under state law, the amendment should say something to the effect of the recreational use of marijuana in the state of Missouri is not unconstitutional and may be regulated by general statute.
Did legislators in Jefferson City sort of punt? Did they just say, hands off, we're going to put this in the Constitution? Why not get into the debate of it all?
My understanding is that the legislature was working on it, and there are at least serious allegations that the people behind this amendment wrote this amendment as a way to enrich themselves, and they put a lot of money to stopping any sort of statutory reform.
You find those allegations credible?
They're credible, doesn't mean they're true.
Okay, let's move on. You've also subscribed to, signed on in support of this newer theory. Close political observers will understand the phrase or may recognize the phrase, the independent legislature theory. But I want you to clarify that for a moment. It sounds like you think courts should play little to no role in overseeing how aggressive legislators get in drawing or gerrymandering districts?
No, unfortunately, a lot of people that aren't lawyers have made claims about what I said that's totally inaccurate.
Okay.
What I have said was that both Moore and Harper are wrong. Moore says that the Elections Clause of the Constitution gives redistricting authority to the legislature.
Alone.
Alone. The other side has said, no, the Elections Clause gives redistricting authority to the state as a whole, and that would allow the courts to have judicial review. What I'm saying is time, place, and manner, that's what the Election Clause gives control over. None of those have redistricting. When you vote has nothing to do with redistricting. Where your polling place is chosen, whether it's the church, the elementary school, or whatnot, is not in the Constitution for redistricting. And the manner, whether you're voting with a voice vote, raising your hand, secret ballot, the Constitution does not ascribe who has control over redistricting. Therefore, the 10th Amendment controls, which says it's the people that have control over redistricting.
Or the legislature.
No, it's the people, and they ascribe who will do it through the Constitution. So in Arizona, where the Constitution says we're going to have a citizens commission that does it, that's been by the people. That's what the 10th Amendment should say. In Missouri, we say that the legislature should do it, but we say that they have to be compact and contiguous, so the state courts should be able to make sure that those requirements that the people put in the Constitution are followed.
So it sounds like you're saying the way it is now is fine. Why sign on to this theory then?
I didn't sign on to the theory.
You didn't file an amicus brief in support
I filed an amicus brief in support of neither party, because what I said was both parties are using the elections clause, and it doesn't say what either of them says it says.
Okay. Is that kind of like casting a present vote in the legislature?
No, because a present vote doesn't really do anything. My concern is if either Moore or Harper win and the Supreme Court affirms and says, yes, the elections clause covers redistricting, then the federal government has total control over redistricting, and Congress can redraw their own congressional districts, and I think that's a really bad idea.
Well, certainly they would not be a disinterested party, as the courts are supposed to be, and certainly state legislatures have proven they're not exactly disinterested parties in drawing and picking their own voters as well. I want to just put a pin in this and move on. On the independent legislature theory, do you think that courts do have oversight in not only how lawmakers may pick their voters, but in how they certify the results, the delivery of certification from the state legislature to Congress? Some have argued the independent legislature theory means courts can't oversee any of that. Do you see any connection there? How would you?
Well, in this case, I believe that the Constitution of Missouri has given the courts oversight in part over that process, so the court does have that oversight.
All right, secretaries of state don't only oversee elections, they also oversee libraries, public libraries across the state. You've called for new rules to restrict what kind of books can be put on shelves in state-funded libraries, or they could risk being defunded. What's an example of content you'd like to see removed or censored at libraries?
What I have said is that if a library is going to take state taxpayer funds, they cannot use those funds to buy materials that appeal to the prurient interest of minors. There is no prohibition against them using other funds to do that, but they're not allowed to use the state funds.
Who decides what that definition
The second
entails?
part of really what I've done in that rule is I've said that you need to certify that you have policies, a written, publicly accessible policy that shows how you give age designations to material, and then you have to have a policy that is written and publicly accessible for how individuals can challenge those age designations. So what I've said is if you're a library, you can't use the state money we give you for those materials. Then you have to have a policy that your local library will create, so it will vary based on the libraries, of how you decide what's age appropriate for certain ages or not, and then you have to display and release material according to that policy.
This might sound new. A lot of it is actually regurgitated debate on the principle, because in the 1980s our country did go through sort of a moral panic. There was a lot of different censoring, labeling of what movies, TV shows kids could and should consume. We came out with labels. Libraries have had that long ago. You're familiar with the Dewey Decimal System, and as you know...
Well, they don't use Dewey Decimal anymore.
Right, but you understand the principle in theory. There's also the idea that parents have a role here, and as you know, local library boards already decide what controversial books they may or may not put on their shelves.
Right.
If it's from, Mein Kampf is a ridiculous example, right? But do they put that on the shelves? So why do you trust library boards, local governments, and parents to do their job?
Well, first of all, this rule empowers parents to do that. It gives them visibility and transparency into what the guidelines are.
Doesn't it threaten to take over local control?
Not at all, because the local library writes the policies.
But you take away their funding if they don't do what you want.
I didn't write their policy. I'm giving them the ability to write their policy. I'm just requiring that it be transparent and that the person that writes it be accountable to the local taxpayers.
Aren't local library board members already accountable to the local voters?
I'm not really sure they are. Let me give you an example. I was at a meeting of public library directors in Columbia, and they were talking about the concerns they have with people challenging books and whatnot. And they asked me, and I said, well, what you really need to make sure you do is that you're representing your district, because each library has a slightly different group of people that, the social norms are different depending on where you are in the state. You're paid for by those taxpayers. You need to make sure you're representing the wishes and desires of people that pay for it. Mm-hmm. And I had librarians that said, no, what we put in the library is entirely up to us. We put whatever we want, and we need to put something that applies to everybody. And I said, now wait a minute. And I thought I would use absurdity to prove a point, and well, you'll understand that I was evidently wrong. I said, you don't have someone in your library, something in your library that represents everyone in your community, because you don't have a book on how to be a child molester. Of course they don't, right? I thought I was being absurd. Do you know what the response was?
I think I read your quote that you said.
The response was, because they won't publish them.
Right, and if they did, the library board still has discretion not to put it out there.
No, the librarian was saying they don't have them because they don't publish them. If they did publish them, they would have them. And what I'm saying is, I don't believe the people of the state of Missouri want their taxpayer dollars to go for things like that. And if librarians want to have things like that in their library, that needs to be according to their policy, and the people that they represent have to know that and be able to dispute it.
It's an interesting moment in our political discourse right now, because there has been, as you're aware and as you're alluding to, increased focus on the content in books, the content that kids read. Of course, you would agree, there is a vast world of information available at their fingertips on the internet.
Potentially, yes.
Whereas a book, you check it out, parents hopefully know what the kids are reading. Do you think that banning books or restricting books is an effective method, or does it make the kids want to read it more?
First of all, I didn't ban any books.
I'm asking generally about the
topic. Let's just be careful to make sure that no one listening to this thinks I've banned books. This policy doesn't ban any books from being in the library.
It threatens state funding if they don't go along.
It does not require them to ban any books to get state funding.
It applies the pressure of the state to local government.
What book does it require them not to have in their library or risk state funding?
I've asked you that question to define an
and
example
I'm telling
of
you,
content.
there is not one.
Right.
Well, I just told you there isn't, and you said, well, no, it puts funding. Look, what this might require is that they're not using taxpayer dollars to buy this book that solely applies to the pure interest of a minor.
Sure.
But they can use other money they have.
I think it's a vague description. There are libraries that want to see a more clear description of what that is.
But the libraries get to write they get to write the policy.
Mm-hmm.
Are they saying they want me to write their policy? I don't think one statewide policy is the right way to go about it. I'm letting the local library write the policy.
You're starting an interesting debate across the state. We can move on. I see your point about what
there are no
policy you'd
books
like.
that are banned.
Mm-hmm.
What it might require is a book that they admit is not age appropriate for 5-year-olds. They have to make sure isn't in the 5-year-old section.
Very interesting. Good discussion. I want to get one last topic in before we let you go. Or we want to move on to our next guest as well. But you've also recently, Missouri has changed its election law. This is one of the things that maybe people don't know, or it's not widely known yet, is come 2024, when it's time to pick a president, Missouri voters won't be voting in a presidential primary.
Right. As of now. There is some thought that might change. For about almost the last 6 presidential primaries, we have had both a presidential preference primary and a caucus. Mm-hmm. And I call it a presidential preference primary because it didn't matter.
Because
the party said your presidential primary is too early in the year, therefore you have to have a caucus to actually pick the delegates.
You oversee elections, you're close to these issues. Let me ask you the question this way. Do you trust Missouri voters to pick a president or a presidential candidate that would represent their party?
I pick the people, Missouri voters, in any election.
I don't understand your answer. Do you want primary voters to pick a presidential nominee in Missouri?
What I want is either to have a caucus where the people of Missouri pick or a primary where they pick. I don't want to have a primary election where we pretend that they get to pick it, but it actually gets done in the caucus, and that's what's been happening for years.
So you could be supportive of voters voting in a primary that matters?
Sure, but I want their vote to actually pick the delegates, not them to pretend they are, and then party insiders pick the delegates.
Secretary Ashcroft, a pleasure to have you with us. We hope to have you back. Before we let you go, would you like to address at all, react at all to the tragedy we saw in St. Louis, the school shooting this week?
You know, I just want to say thank you to the teacher that lost her life, because she was willing to put her life in the way instead of her students. And I grieve with the other set of parents that lost the young daughter. I think it's really unfortunate. We don't know all the facts, but right now one of the things I want to do is praise that teacher.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And St. Louis grieved the loss of that high school student and a teacher this week, as we have reported, killed in a mass shooting at the Central Visual and Performing Arts High School. That was on Monday. Since then, law enforcement has pieced together and reported what they know about what happened there. Elected officials highlighted steps they could take to prevent gun violence in the future. We caught up with one of those candidates, Trudy Bush Valentine, the Democrat running for the U.S. Senate, at a vigil on Monday night.
We have to stop the violence that is going on in our schools. We have to stop the killing of innocent children. I will do everything I can to stop this from happening. It never ends. Now it's happened in St. Louis. It should end here. We can stop this if people get together and say this can't happen anymore. And if we stop selling guns to people under 21. The federal law is that pistols cannot be sold to people under 21. Here we're selling long guns to 18-year-olds. It's totally wrong.
Missouri House Democrat Trish Gunby joins us now. On the record, you're running for Congress against Congresswoman Ann Wagner. I want to ask you about that question there. If you can't buy a beer, should you be able to buy a rifle in America?
I would take it a step further, and I would say, why are we selling assault weapons? And why are we selling 300 rounds of magazines?
Define that, an assault weapon.
Well, a military weapon that in our military stays locked away and is only taken out for training purposes, or if it's going to be used, for military action. So in the United States, we've decided that that's okay for civilians.
Pardon me, I noticed that red button on your lapel, Moms Demand Action. We heard from some mothers demanding action at the vigil in St. Louis on Monday night after the school shooting earlier that day. What was your reaction there, and what more would you commit to doing from Congress to make it less likely that violence like that would occur in classrooms?
We have decided that it is okay to see children and educators shot in our classrooms. We value those weapons, AR-15s, more than we do students and teachers. And so as a society, we have to decide if that's who we are going to be. So I would absolutely, I'm a gun sense candidate. I filed gun storage legislation when I was in the state legislature, bipartisan legislation that did not advance under Republicans. And so I would absolutely support recent federal legislation that Ann Wagner voted against an active shooter alert system, a ban on assault weapons, and against mental health services, behavior services in schools to help with events like this.
Missouri Senator Roy Blunt voted for the expansion of those mental health services and some of those different provisions that Congress did take action on. It was probably the most fundamental gun safety legislation Congress has passed in a few decades. We do hope to hear from Congresswoman Wagner before Election Day. We've invited her on this program. I want to show her tweet. Your opponent, Congresswoman Wagner, tweeted after the school shooting that she was, quote, just devastated about the senseless loss of life at Central Visual and Performing Arts High School in the city of St. Louis, and she's grateful for the swift response of our law enforcement. What was your, I know I've asked you this question, but what was your reaction there? What do you make of hers? And if I can, some Republicans often, in the wake of school tragedies, school shootings or other mass shootings, will say, this is not the time to get political. What do you say to that?
It's not being political. It is life or death. That knows no party. Democrats get killed, Republicans get killed, independents get killed. That's what we're talking about. So I don't see it as being political. I see it as we need to decide if we value children and educators and people in society in general, because we've had these mass shootings at other events, do we value them more than the weapons that are used to kill them?
These races for Congress can draw out some bitter debates that our society, that our country grapples with on guns and abortion. I don't know if there are two topics more divisive, controversial than those. On abortion, we're seeing a lot of interest from voters, especially after the Dobbs decision. I want to play a quick soundbite we had with Congresswoman Wagner asking her about the state restrictions that Missouri enacted into law. Take a look. Missouri voted to restrict all abortion, even in cases of rape and incest, except for the life of the mother, I believe, in Missouri. Did the Missouri legislature go too far?
The state legislatures have, the Dobbs case said this gets returned to the state legislatures. I don't know what will happen in the state of Missouri when they go back into session, whether that will be adjusted or changed in any way, shape, or form. I support exceptions for rape, incest, and life of the mother.
So Missouri went too far.
I support restrictions for life of the mother, rape, and incest.
I want to ask you, what would the Missouri legislature do? Did they know what they were doing when they passed the restrictions that did not include exceptions for rape and incest? Do you have any confidence they might roll those parts back?
Given the majority Republican leadership right now and those who are in that in office now, and the fact that the incoming legislature may get more conservative, certainly on the Senate side. We have a member there, Mary Elizabeth Coleman, who is advocating to criminalize people who go across state lines to seek abortion care, to seek reproductive health care.
That's a House Republican now running for the Senate in our neck of the woods.
Yes, yes. So do I think they're going to roll back some things? I don't see that at all. In fact, at the federal level, while Congresswoman Ann Wagner may think that exceptions for rape and incest, that's gone too far, she voted against access to birth control.
She says that's not true.
Well,
when we posed that question to her some time ago after we met with you about this question of student loan debt, she said that you're distorting her position on that.
Well, she's a no vote on access to contraceptives, so that is what is part of public record. So I believe the Republican Party has decided that they are going to be in our exam rooms, in our bedrooms, and certainly here in Missouri, they have decided that a child can get raped, carry a baby to term, deliver that baby, go back to school, and then somebody's going to raise that child, and how we're going to fund those pregnancies, I don't know. But they have decided that that's okay, and I am absolutely against that.
How would you vote in Congress on this issue of abortion? What limits, if any, would you set on the procedure?
I would happily co-sponsor something to codify abortion rights into federal law. In terms of the time frame, I believe the time frame is between a healthcare provider and the patient.
So no limits?
I'm not going to comment in terms of a number. What I'm going to say is that is between a healthcare provider and the patient. Government should not be in your exam room or in your bedroom.
Even in Roe versus Wade, though, the court did determine that states have a significant interest in the life of the fetus in that third trimester, in the late term. It sounds like you would go a step beyond Roe.
I think that that's up to a healthcare provider and the patient.
Okay, I hear you.
Yeah.
How much responsibility does Joe Biden have for inflation?
I believe Democrats under Biden's leadership have actually done some things regarding the cost of living prices. I grocery shop, I put gas in my tank. We have seen the Inflation Reduction Act passed. We have
Which
seen
the Congressional Budget Office, a nonpartisan organization, and the Wharton School of Business, an independent organization, both said would not reduce inflation.
There are elements in there that would drop prescription drug prices for seniors, so that would certainly help seniors.
That's a price cap. It's not a inflationary
Right,
metric.
but so much of inflation, you talk about the cost of things, so that would help seniors. We have an insulin cap, a bill that was capping insulin prices, life-saving medication. That was something that passed. Gas price gouging, that was something that passed. All of those things, Ann Wagner voted no on.
To what extent, I hear you though, you're talking about short-term fixes, well, long-term fixes on the cost of medications, but those are not things that are necessarily experiencing inflation in this moment. Those are long-term issues on the medical side. To what extent is government spending at the federal level driving inflation? To what extent is it the root cause?
Inflation is, this is happening across the world. I mean, we're still coming out of COVID. We're still coming out of supply chain issues. We have the war in Ukraine. There are many factors that play into that. And I'm mindful of the cost. I believe that we will be able to get a handle on that in the short term. Right now, I'm focused obviously on making it so the cost of living is the best that it can be for middle-class Americans. I also want to note that corporations, part of that legislation was taxing corporations. I'm in a situation where I pay more for taxes than likely what Amazon pays. And so there are a lot of different ways that we can address the cost of things. When corporations are making extremely high profits, I think we need to do something about that as well.
Why didn't you vote for Governor Parsons' tax cut proposal?
That was something that is going to help people who have more money. It really proportionately is not bringing that much money back to those individuals who are at the lower income levels. And so again, I think we're just helping people who are more wealthy, and across the board I feel like we need to help people who may need a little bit more help at the lower end of the income level.
As we talk about cost of living and this period of inflation, I think a lot of our voters and viewers would love to know what is something you could do from Congress to reduce their energy costs, whether it's at the gas pump or whether it's at home with their utility bill. Is there something, some policy you can support right now that would directly result in lower energy costs?
I would love to see the United States become a leader in green technology and renewable energy.
But even the biggest optimists in that arena say that's 2035 or 2050. That ain't helping me in the next quarter.
I would just encourage people to be mindful of when they drive, be mindful of you know, conserving fuel as much as you can. There are things in the short term that related to those kinds of costs that we can do. Ride public transportation, perhaps carpool, those sorts of things. Look, you know, energy efficiency in terms of your homes, replacing windows, those kinds of things. So doing things in the short term, but certainly in the long term, we have to address the fact that our planet is warming, and we have to see corporations and individuals prepare for the 21st century down the road. And I hope Americans do that, and we become a leader in that technology.
Might be energy independence, just not tomorrow. It
Right,
might be
exactly,
a while.
exactly.
Watching OPEC and the Saudis control the American energy market certainly has been interesting on that front. Before we let you go, just a question about strategy and outcomes, how you're feeling going into this race. The Cook Political Report, with which I'm sure you are familiar, ranks races by toss-up, likely Democratic, likely Republican, or leaning one way or the other. They identified 85 of the 435 races for Congress in the country as somewhat competitive on that scale. The Missouri 2nd District was not one of them. Why not?
They made a mistake. And I will tell you, I first ran in 2019, was supposed to lose by 10 points, I won by 8 points. I'm in a 50-50 House district. I believe the 2nd Congressional District, as it's currently drawn, is more of a 50-50 district. Nicole Galloway won it.
As it's currently drawn.
I do, I believe that. As it's currently drawn.
It was gerrymandered to help Republicans.
Well, Nicole Galloway won it when she was running for auditor, and Josh Hawley only won it by 2.3 points when he ran back in 2018 before his shenanigans.
So don't sleep on Trish Gunby, you're saying?
No, because we have been in Franklin County, in Warren County, all across St. Charles County, and, well, the portion that's in the district, and St. Louis County, and I'm telling you, voters want to be heard. No matter what, they want to be heard. And we are doing that. We've been doing that for 15 months. More tires, more tennis shoes, and that's what is missing in this district. No in-person public town halls, no congresswoman out in the district, and we tell people that's going to be what makes this race winnable for me.
That's Trish Gunby. We have extended the same invitation to Congresswoman Ann Wagner, and we will have those results for you on election night right here on November 8th. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Last week, Alderman Jack Coder joined us here live on the record to convey his pitch to voters leading up to November 8. As he tries to become the next Board of Aldermen president, he'll be facing Megan Green. The next head of City Hall will lead that chamber through more tumultuous times on the city's horizon. Federal prosecutors already indicted 3 members there, and in the spring, voters will again whittle their ranks in half as the new map doubles the size of districts and divides the number of aldermen. Joining us now live on the record is Alderwoman Megan Green. Thank you for joining us.
Not a problem. Thank you for having me.
There's never a good time for a mass shooting or a school shooting. Of course, it comes right as voters get up to make up their minds. The school shooting in St. Louis will be fresh on their minds as voters walk into the ballot box, but also as they look to their elected officials for some sense of guidance through this this grieving, I should say. What could you do from your perch, should you become Board of Aldermen president, to make sure school shootings don't happen again?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to look at the root causes of this, right? So, you know, what we saw in this is, you know, the police response was phenomenal. They were there within 15 minutes and disarmed the individual. The school had appropriate security and guards on place. I mean, everything, all of the precautions that needed to be in place were there. But what wasn't there was, I think, a recognition of what this kid was going through. You know, as we read his letter that he left behind and the loneliness he was feeling and the disconnectedness from society and the obvious mental health crisis that this kid was having, we missed that. And I think that speaks to a need to greater interventions in, you know, for mental health. destigmatizing mental health.
Put a finer point on that for me if you can. What does that actually look like in its application?
So I think it looks like a variety of things. I mean, making sure that we have adequate mental health resources in schools to identify kids that are struggling or who have trauma and align them with those resources.
Could the school have plugged him into something more directly? Or
I think, the issue I often find, in schools is that there's not enough resources. It's not intensive enough for what a lot of kids who are really struggling or who are living in trauma need. But beyond schools, because this person had been outside of school for a year, I believe, our community needs more investment in mental health. It can be very difficult to get into counseling, especially if you are somebody who is uninsured or underinsured, to be able to find a counselor, to afford counseling, and to get those ongoing mental health supports that you need.
Many of these debates, public policy debates about mental health, about gun control or gun safety measures, and about the holistic approach, these aren't new debates. These are debates that we've had for a long time, but often a candidate's positions are tested through times of trial. 4 years ago, you ran for this same position, and you said this. Take a listen.
What role, if any, do you believe is the appropriate role of police officers in schools? And we're going to start with Alderwoman Green.
Quite frankly, I don't think that there is a role for police officers in schools. I think that there's roles for social workers and mental health workers in schools. I think that there's roles for mentors in schools.
Do you still believe that there is no role for police officers in schools?
So I think we have to make a distinction between the unarmed public safety officers that we saw in the schools and police officers. And I think we have to recognize that the role that the school to prison pipeline can play when we do have armed officers that can put kids into the criminal justice system from our schools, and the negative impact that can have on students for a long term.
So the perception that they have is different if it's an armed police officer versus an unarmed, or even some cases an armed school resource officer?
Correct. And once a student is in the criminal justice system, they often view themselves differently. They see themselves as being a problem, as somebody who's less than, and it actually encourages the behavior to continue. And we have tons of research on this that tells us that this is true. And so there are ways that we can do school discipline to make schools safer that are not criminalizing the kids that are in our schools.
I don't want to only view the broad long term through this moment. We are in this moment, though, about public safety, and people are looking at that. You wrote in a recent blog post that St. Louis police only solve about 25% of murders, well below the national average. Yes. And you highlighted that they only spend roughly 4% of their workday preventing violence. Let's dig into each of those ideas that you raised one by one. Is it really fair to question how much time police officers spend on their day in violence? It's not like they get to decide when and where violence happens, or it's not like violence is literally happening all day 24/7. What point were you trying to make there?
So the point I'm trying to make is a lot of the things that we're asking our officers to do right now are actually not things that are under their purview or things that they're trained to do. They're things that we need social workers to do, or mental health counselors, or homeless outreach workers, or substance abuse counselors to be working on. And so the point that I'm trying to make is we should be hiring those professionals who actually are trained to engage with those types of issues and individuals to address those issues, because that will then free up our officers' time to spend it on actual crime, to spend it on violent crime, which is where they should be focusing their time.
You highlighted the murder solve rate. Said it was at 25%. Other parts of the country are much higher at 60%. Of course, if you can solve a murder, you might prevent a future one.
Correct.
But why raise that? Are you blaming police?
I'm not blaming police at all. What I'm also pointing out in that statement is that if we take a lot of these things off the plate of police that they're doing right now, that other professionals could do, it frees up their time to actually work on homicide investigations, to actually work on violent crime, and not be focusing time management. It's how we allocate our resources and make sure that we are using our police resources effectively, and we are using other professionals who are more trained to deal with some of these quality of life issues or issues associated with poverty, to actually dive in and help those individuals.
You're running for this role at a time, a very interesting time in the city, when federal prosecutors just brought indictments against 3 of your former colleagues for the way that they took cash bribes in exchange for public funds, public incentives, tax incentives, these development dollars that the city was doling out. That's an interesting discussion. One county police officer just this last weekend told me that the two go hand in hand.
Yes.
The better you can create jobs and businesses, there's an old line, nothing, I forget how it goes, but you give someone a job and you take a gun out of their hand. You know,
Yeah.
put a shovel in their hand, there's no gun in the hand.
Yeah.
Do you see those two as intrinsically tied together, public safety and economic growth?
They absolutely are. I mean, we know that, I think it was Aristotle that said that, you know, poverty is the root of crime, right?
I didn't expect an Aristotle quote.
You know, I always try to bring something new. But the point, I think, stays that, you know, when you address poverty, when you make sure people aren't hungry, when they have their basic needs met, you see crime go down. And you see that in communities across this country, across the world. And that's what we've been missing in St. Louis, is we only spend about a little over 1% of our budget right now on health and human services as a city. You know, that means that we are undercutting homeless services, affordable housing, mental health services, substance abuse services, all of these things that we know are essential to actually prevent crime. And that's what I want us to be focusing on, is that crime prevention piece that we have long been leaving out.
Government budgets can often be a moral document that say where the city's collective priorities lie.
Yeah.
And I want to play for you a soundbite from the Board of Aldermen just last Friday as they met. One of your colleagues, Tom Oldenburg, speaking a little bit about that as the city was getting ready to allocate more money to a local taxing district, but it was how that money was being divvied up and spent that he was zeroing in on. Listen.
Yeah.
We are witnessing a trend. Now, this trend is a retreat from progressive politics as it pertains to anti-policing, the defund the police movement, the reimagine, do more with less cops movements that we've seen throughout our city. The trend is not lost on me that we've had very progressive members of this board seek private public safety protection through the use of these taxing districts. We're seeing the reversal and a retreat of an anti-police movement because at the end of the day, folks want protection and they're going to do it themselves. We are witnessing a trend.
Do you see that? The rest of his quote there was, they're going to do it themselves. Do you see that retreat that he describes away from progressive politics in the city hall, or is he wrong?
I absolutely do not. I mean, when you look at the testimony of Alderwoman Schweitzer, who was looking to forward this deal, they actually, or no, this one was Annie Rice,
I believe you're right.
I believe. Alderwoman Schweitzer we had a few weeks before.
Alderwoman Rice is correct, yes.
But what they did that I think is quite different from the way that these taxing districts have been set up historically is they delineated how much of the tax dollars could be spent on each area. And it actually reduced the amount that was spent on the policing portion of it, the security portion of it. And it increased the amount that would be spent on community activities, community building, things that actually address those root causes of crime.
We sometimes distill politics into buzzwords. Your opponent has said, well, you want to defund the police. You heard Tom Oldenburg there say, do more with less cops. We're seeing all these little buzzwords and lines come out here. I wonder, though, can a person believe in pursuing more police with higher pay and better training and what you're calling for, this expanded social support system? Why do the two have to be at conflict?
I mean, they don't necessarily have to be a conflict, except for the fact that we have limited resources as a city. So I think it is incumbent upon us to make sure that we are spending those resources wisely. So when we are already one of the highest staffed police departments per capita in the country, I think we have an issue with allocating our resources, not so much the number of police resources that we have. Now, we need to look at how this police department is structured. Let's restructure it so it's not so top heavy, so that there's more cops that are actually out on the street. And let's get the things off of the plates of police that really aren't things that they are trained to do. All of those mental health calls and homelessness calls and substance abuse calls that are better addressed by people who are trained in those areas.
A lively discussion. Thank you. I want to give you the same opportunity we gave the Secretary of State before we let you go. Is there anything you'd like to say to those people in our audience, or maybe the families of those grieving what happened in the school in St. Louis before we go?
You know, I definitely, to the families, this has been an incredibly difficult week, I think, for all of St. Louis, and our hearts ache. And my role as president of the board will be to make sure that this never happens again. And we have to recognize that even outside of school shootings, we have to be addressing gun violence. There's a program from Richmond, California called Operation Peacemaker that saw 55% reduction in violent crime over 5 years that I think we should be bringing here. We have strategies, national strategies that we know that work, that can prevent crime. We have to be willing to have the leadership with the vision to incorporate these proven strategies into our own public safety strategy.
Alderwoman Megan Green, we're running out of time, but thank you for joining us. Right now, if you're a voter in Missouri or Illinois, there is a voter guide up on our website, ksdk.com. You can go there to learn more about this race for the Board of Aldermen president or any other big race that you might see on that ballot on November 8th. And we'll be right back here with Anita Mannion, our political scientist and professor, expert on all things politics, to break down and analyze what you need to know in that voter guide for the record. Until then, we're off the record.